Homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. The question that's been asked is, should we understand impermanence through the contemplation of arising and passing away of the five aggregates? Are there any such instructions from the Buddha that confirm this? To answer this question, let's begin with the Four Noble Truths. So we have the arising and passing away through the Four Noble Truths. So the first two Noble Truths, so the first Noble Truth of dukkha, the suffering, and then the second Noble Truth of the origin of dukkha, being craving or tanha. These two are normally associated with the arising, the origin, so the samudaya. And then when you have the third and fourth Noble Truth, so the third is the cessation of all suffering, and then the fourth is the way out, the way leading to the cessation of suffering, so the Noble Eightfold Path. That usually refers to the passing away, the atangama. So sometimes anicca can be explained as meaning the arising and passing away phenomena. So when you look at the arising part, the samudaya, what you find is that because we have birthed this body, we experience the suffering. This is the vipaka karma of having birthed this body. Because of the birth, you experience aging, you experience sickness, and then you experience death. That particularly is true in seeing the unlasting nature of what we have birthed. So through the five aggregates, this is what comes to be. And so the origin of that is when we crave, when we have craving, we have delight, welcome, remain holding, and all of that. And so the passing away is really when we don't do that. When we don't do that process and kick off, activate the dependent origination, then that comes to an end. And the Noble Eightfold Path supports that. When we take refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, particularly in the Buddha's teachings, we understand that we don't take anything outside of Nibbana as me and mine. Because when we take anything outside of Nibbana as me and mine, we're taking these bodies, these sense bases, these sense faculties, all the sense objects. We cling, we crave, we misapprehend and take them as me and mine. And so you kick off the whole mass of suffering again when you have any kind of volition, any kind of intention to birth another body, whether it's gross or subtle. So that's what we look at when we look at the Four Noble Truths. And that's why sometimes you find people when they say the meaning of anicca, the unlastingness, the impermanence, the fleeting nature, the death-bound nature, is to see the arising and passing away of the five aggregates. So the Buddha always asks us to contemplate the five aggregates. That's a very huge part of his teaching, is because through the five aggregates we cling. And when we cling, we're clinging out of the misapprehension about these five aggregates. So when it comes to form, he always says to us, one of the examples or the similes is to contemplate it as a lump of foam. For feeling, it's to contemplate it as a water bubble. And for perception, to contemplate it as a mirage. Volitional formations, to contemplate it as a banana tree, the trunk of a banana tree. And consciousness, to contemplate it as a magic trick. And the reason for that is there are three different things that the Buddha wants us to look at, which is voidness or hollowness, that it is also empty or worthless, there's no value there. And the third one is that there's no substance, there's no essence. And when you contemplate the arising and passing away of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, you really see that to be true. And so it's a huge part of the Buddha's teaching is to actually correct one's view around it, correct the perversion that comes when you misapprehend at the perception level, all these five aggregates, where you have volitional formations that assign value, that trigger underlying tendencies in these ideas, in these thoughts, and then get embedded as wrong view. And so the contemplation of arising and passing away of the five aggregates is very useful in being able to see through that, particularly in conjunction with the Four Noble Truths. So there are suttas where the Buddha gives clear instructions around contemplating the perception of impermanence through the arising and passing away of the five aggregates. And one of them is this Aniccasaññā Sutta in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, discourse number 102. And the Buddha is at Savatthi, and he says to the monks, Bhikkhus, when the perception of impermanence is developed and cultivated, it eliminates all sensual lust, it eliminates all lust for existence, it eliminates all ignorance, it uproots all conceit, I am. And then the Buddha gives quite a few examples showing how one does actually eliminate all that kind of lust and ignorance and the conceit, I am. So for example, he gives, just because in the autumn a ploughman ploughing with a great ploughshare cuts through all the rootlets as he ploughs. And that's in the same way to eliminating sensual lust, lust for existence, ignorance, and uprooting conceit, I am. Another one is when a rush cutter would cut down a rush, grab it by the top and shake it down and shake it out and thump it about. And then so many different other examples similar to that. And then the Buddha goes on and says, and how, bhikkhus, is the perception of impermanence developed and cultivated so that it eliminates all sensual lust, eliminates all lust for existence, eliminates all ignorance, and uproots all conceit, I am? So the answer that the Buddha gives is, such is form, such its arising, such its passing away. Then he does the same thing, such is feeling, such its arising, such its passing away, and then the same for perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. And so he says that is how the perception of impermanence is developed and cultivated, and so on and so forth. So it's very clear that one understands the perception of impermanence or unlastingness, this aniccasaññā, through the arising and passing away of the five aggregates. So this is something that when we do this Samādhibhāvanā Sutta, we are actually also understanding the meaning of this perception of impermanence. And you can see why that is true. It's because there is a fleeting nature to all five aggregates. We misapprehend by taking it with delight, welcoming it, remaining holding, and therefore delight arises. We cling and we want to come to exist, and then we birth. And so then you experience aging and death, and then the whole mass of suffering. And then the passing away is when that doesn't arise in that way. So let's look at that jnanapata, the knowledge or insight pathway. So on this slide you can see the meditations that we were doing from Poya. One side is the samudaya, so the part that leads to the whole mass of suffering when we crave. And the second is the athangama, the passing away, when we don't crave, we don't kick off that process of craving. And so it doesn't lead to the whole mass of suffering. So really when you go through this process, if you take one aggregate as an example, when you take form, when one seeks delight, welcomes, remains holding to form, we have misapprehended form as subha, as fair instead of asubha, foul. And so when we see that, we're not seeing the unlasting nature of it as well. And therefore we take it as mine. We grasp onto it, we take delight in it, we cling to it. And therefore when we see other forms and misapprehend our own form, we want to create another ear, eye, nose, tongue, body and mind. Therefore we come to exist again, we birth, we are subject to aging and death as a result of birth, and then the whole mass of suffering. So you can see how dependent origination kicks off and how we don't understand the fleetingness of all these forms. The same applies to feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. We keep establishing consciousness in the wrong place because we don't understand the first noble truth, the second noble truth, and therefore we can't realize the third and fourth. So when it comes to athangama, there is a wisdom that comes with having understood samudaya of these five aggregates, and so you decide it's actually outside of nibbana, it's always sliding, it's a death trap. All these things are death bound, you can't sustain them, they're not lasting, they're subject to change. Therefore, you don't seek delight, you don't welcome, you don't remain holding. Nabi nandati, nabi vadati, najo sayatitati. Therefore, nandi doesn't arise. It ceases because you haven't kicked that process off. Therefore, you have the cessation of clinging, the cessation of existence. Therefore, there is no birth. As there is no birth, there is no aging and death, and therefore the cessation of all suffering. So one can understand anicca through the arising and passing away of the five aggregates. And so the meditation that we learned for Poya, the Samādhibhāvanā Sutta, it's a very important one, because through the five aggregates we construct and we reconstruct. And this is our underlying tendency. When the Buddha talks about in that Aniccasaññā Sutta that you really uproot the conceit I am, and that you really eradicate the lust for sensual things, the lust for existence, and you destroy ignorance. It's really because you really see with the wisdom eye that this is a bad concoction. This is something that you've been duped by, deceived by. And so when you keep doing the same thing, you're still bound for the same horrible predicament. Any happiness or pleasure that is taken is fleeting. And there is no lasting happiness in it. And that's why on the Arya path, you don't take anything outside Nibbana as mine. You don't take these five aggregates as mine. You don't take any of the external things that you perceive as mine. And so you leave all those things there and you meditate and you realize that what the Buddha says is true. Saddha increases, conviction increases when you actually see this in your meditation. You realize Buddha is actually correct. And therefore you take refuge in what the Buddha says. So I'll leave the answer here. We can share the merit with all sentient beings. May all beings be happy and well. May all beings be free from suffering. May the doors of Nibbana be open to all living beings. Blessings of the Triple Gem. Wishing you all well. Theruwan saranai.